This is the Computational Analysis and Modeling of Transdiagnostic Psychiatric Speech Sample Symposium. And we have a collection of 4 great presentations for you here today. We're going to begin with Dr. Einat Liebenthal presenting verbal fluency, biomarkers of thought and communication disturbances in psychotic illness. We'll then go to Dail presenting longitudinal analysis of speaking rate in patients with severe mental illness using daily audio diaries and dynamic structural equation modeling. Then we'll have Dr. Daniel Lowe presenting a longitudinal ecological momentary assessment study of individuals at high risk for suicide towards a suicidal speech model. And finally, Dr. Zarina Bilgrami. The end got cut off, so I apologize. Maybe I've got the whole thing here. We've got, So using large language models to predict conversion to psychosis from disruptions at the word, sentence, and narrative levels, perhaps? Okay, great. So again, thank you. We'll have some time after each presentation, actually, for some questions specific to that presentation. And then after all 4, I'll moderate a discussion where we can open it up to more general purpose discussion about speech samples, about transdiagnostic modeling, and all this really great stuff. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Liebenthal.
Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see so many familiar faces that I see online all the time. So. It's an exciting time to be working in this field. I'm trying to get to the next slide.
Maybe the clicker?
Clicker, okay, thank you. It's a very exciting time to be working in this field because irregularities in spoken language can reflect those disturbances in thought and communication abilities that are associated with affective and psychotic disorders. Much of the computational work that is being done on spoken language in psychiatry has focused on the very challenging task of objective measurement of semantic and syntactic incoherence. And, but we've observed in prior work that disturbances in more scalable measures of verbosity, verbal fluency, and voice quality are also useful for characterizing psychotic and affective illness. So this is what I'll be talking about mostly. So the 2 studies that I'll be presenting are part of a project that was led by Justin Baker and Scott Rausch. And in this, the primary objective here was to, we collected multiple data streams in a cohort of individuals with severe mental illness, either affective or psychotic primary disorders. And the primary objective was to detect features in the raw data that are quantitatively associated with latent psychiatric variables. So the main, for our purposes today, the main data that were the main language samples that were collected were language samples during clinical interviews that were collected on a monthly basis, and also on a daily basis, audio journals and ecological momentary assessments. These data were collected. The idea here is to characterize individuals in the wild with as little burden as possible, and to characterize their behavior in their natural environments. We collected a lot of data. So again, for our purposes today, over 1,000 clinical interviews and over 11,000 audio journals and ecological momentary assessments. And this will become important later, but to analyze these data, if we want to look at the audio journals versus clinical outcomes, or versus ecological momentary assessment, with the data availability is we need these data to be available on the same day for the same individuals. So that will be important for our analysis. So the first language analysis of this data set was an analysis of the clinical interviews. And we were mostly interested here in conceptual disorganization. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, here is an example of one participant. This is a 25-year-old male with schizoaffective bipolar type. And he lives in a group home, and he likes to play poker. He participated in the study for quite some time. Let's see if this works. So he was for the study for almost for 90 weeks, and during that time, he participated in those monthly clinical interviews fairly regularly. And many times he was considered to be moderately conceptually disorganized, which means his thinking was loose and he had difficulty expressing complex thoughts. This is an expert from one of those interviews, and so you can get a sense here. His vocabulary is actually quite fine. He's using words such as counterproductive, complacency, I'm at odds, and so on. But he's taking a lot of words to express little content, and there are a lot of what we count as disfluencies, such as verbal disfluencies and filler words like and kind and I mean, and so on. So that overall, he's taking a lot of words to express fairly little content. And indeed, when we look at this quantitatively, when this person was more conceptually disorganized, they had more disfluencies per sentence and also more words per sentence. So when we did this analysis over a larger group, we found that those relationships held. People who were more conceptually disorganized had more disfluency, so more restarts per sentence, repeats, verbal edits, and they were also more verbose. They used more words. So now on to the second study, the second language study that we conducted in this cohort. So here we're looking at the audio journals. First, this is, again, to give you a feel of the data. This is just a qualitative assessment. So this was a different subject, 50-year-old male with bipolar disorder 1. And they liked to do the audio journals and the EMAs. Those are collected on a daily basis. This person was in the study for a very long time, and this is just a qualitative analysis of a fellow in the lab who looked at their first 175 days in the study. So this person, in their EMA, or regularly reported that they were quite lonely and anxious, and also quite active. And in their audio surveys, they did these quite religiously and used the whole 4 minutes of those audio surveys and told about their life events, father's death anniversary, financial troubles, family reunion, and so on. And those are annotations that were done manually, but the sentiment analysis captured those quite well. So this was very encouraging in our first dive into this data set. And then, so here comes the quantitative analysis of that same data set, because of course listening to all these audio surveys one by one is not something that's scalable. So in this analysis, we were interested in looking at the relationships between the features, the voice and speech and language features of the audio surveys, and their relationships to all the range of symptomatologies shown by the participants. So first I should say that the statistical analysis of this data was conducted by Dail Chun, who's the next speaker, and mentored by Jeff Girard. So the first thing that we did here was to look for the distributions and how the different symptoms clustered. So we conducted a factor analysis to look at that. What went into this analysis is 918 observations from this study, which are PANSS scores, MADRS scores, YMRS scores. Some of these items were excluded due to different reasons. And so what came out of this analysis is 6 different factors: mania, disorganized thinking, depression, cognitive, depression affective, anxiety, negative symptoms, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. So these are the outcome scores that we were looking at. And we selected a set of voice and language and speech features that we thought was representative of different domains. We're still expanding those, but this was the starting lineup. These are the features. And we looked at those relationships also on different time scales, because the auditory features are collected on a daily basis, whereas the clinical features are collected on a monthly basis. So we hypothesized that those relationships might vary over time from the time when the symptoms were assessed. So we looked at different time windows. So here, this is a short time window, 4 days, 409 observations from 51 subjects. And what we see, so I'll just highlight some of the main findings here. So negative sentiment was associated with most of the symptoms. And another mania was associated with a high speech rate. And disorganization was associated, in addition, with low pitch or low expressivity or low intonation in the voice. So these were the main findings at 4 days. With a 7-day window, so going a little farther out from the time of the assessment of the clinical scores, we are still seeing that same relationship with the sentiment scores. Negative sentiment is still predicting most of the scores. Mania is still associated with high rate. And disorganization is weakly associated with disfluency, which is what we were looking for from the analysis of the clinical interviews. And then we're seeing some new associations, so anxiety and also depression weakly are associated with low jitter and high shimmer. And high shimmer would sound like a hoarse voice or a rough voice. And then going farther out into 13 days from the clinical interview, we are actually losing this association of mania and of disorganization, but those other associations with jitter and shimmer for anxiety and also here for depression, these are becoming stronger. And there's also a negative association here, lower rate of speech for negative symptoms. So this is a summary of all the findings. This is really just to say that different symptoms are associated with different patterns of irregularities and disturbances in speech. So here is my summary. All the symptoms were associated with negative language sentiment. Mania was associated with increased speech rate. Negative symptoms were associated with decreased speech rate. Depression and anxiety were associated with reduced jitter and increased shimmer. Disorganization and some of the other symptoms were associated with reduced pitch. Disorganization was weakly associated with increased speech disfluencies. Overall, the voice diaries contain signal from the voice, speech, and language of an individual which are relevant to predicting their emotional and cognitive state. Different symptoms are associated with specific profiles. Mania, another really interesting aspect of these data, which we intend to explore further, and you'll hear about more in Dail's talk, is that mania and disorganization tended to be associated with altered features on a short time scale, whereas depression, negative symptoms, and anxiety tended to be associated with altered features on a longer time scale. And this is important insight. This is it. Thank you very much for my collaborators and fundings and for your attention, and happy to get questions, I think, at the end or now.
We can do some now, yeah.
Okay. Sunny. Sure, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure.
Hi, I had two questions, if I may. This is really fascinating work. Thank you so much. First, I just wanted to make sure I understood clearly the kinds of relationships that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that within individuals, those features were tracking with those symptom trajectories, right? As opposed to between individual differences, like Jeff has pointed out in his earlier work.
Yeah. You're right, I didn't really say much about this, but yes, this analysis was conducted within individual, yes.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. And sorry, my second question was, I was wondering, when looking at psychosis, I think one particular feature has gained a lot of attention, and one particular range of features in terms of looking at semantic similarities across either utterances or tokens. There's been like group level effects and even like predictions of conversion from psychosis. I wonder if Zarina is going to be talking about that later. So I was wondering, I was wondering if you were planning to look at that as well, because it would be so cool to see whether or not that's fluctuating on that kind of time scale.
Absolutely, and in fact, Zarina is partially responsible for us not showing it today, because we are still looking for a good way to look at semantic irregularities, and we might use some of the methods that she's developed, but absolutely looking. And I just wanted to add to the analysis was conducted within subject, but those effects that are being shown here are the fixed effects that are consistent across individuals. Yeah,
Right.
just wanted to clarify.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Can you talk a little bit more about how a higher negative versus positive symptom profile may have shown differently in the speech patterns?
So, finding effects with mania was actually really interesting, because when in some prior analysis, when we're looking at whether this is actually not part of this talk, but when we're looking at the ecological momentary assessments and trying to find relationships with the positive symptoms, it's often much more challenging. And so here, finding the relationships between mania and fast speech rate is actually, an important finding. And we will continue to examine the data, but it seems that because these relationships are on a shorter time scale, and possibly people are less good about reporting the positive symptoms, those could be two reasons contributing to the difficulty of finding relationships with positive symptoms. But,
Cool.
I don't know if
Maybe
that
time
helps.
for one more.
Okay.
And there'll be time at the end for a lot more discussion as well. Just one more for now, yeah. Thank you.
Well, hi, I'm Sophia Vinogradov from Minnesota. This is a bit of a thought experiment and a bit of a, I mean it in a very nice way, a challenge for those of us who think in this field. You know, for a long time, right, many of us have been completely kind of thrown up our hands about the idea of the mental status examination, right? That we're supposed to teach our residents and our medical students, and what does it really mean? What I might label conceptual disorganization from a clinical MSE is going to be very different from what someone else does. What your work, and indeed I think the work of the group more generally, shows is that the mental status exam is actually, you know, when you start to, in a sense, use objective, reliable, you know, sort of, you know, computationally derived measures, right, is much more nuanced, precise, has predictive capacities, perhaps. So, and what we've been teaching clinically is useless in some ways, and yet what you are doing, well, okay, but I believe it's useless. But one could take a more kind of, again, sort of kind of precise, reliable, informed way of assessing a mental status exam, but perhaps it needs to be done on a snapshot basis more frequently to be able to produce these sort of predictive models that are actually going to be of use clinically to an individual patient. So the thought experiment is looking into the future, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, what are we teaching to the residents and medical students, and what tools are they using?
I mean, I'm not a clinician, and maybe other people can also comment, but I will just say that I think that doing audiovisual recordings of those interviews and looking at them quantitatively to support the clinical work is maybe what the future holds. But you know, if anyone else would like to comment, please do. All right. Thank you very much.
Maybe I can say more later, but I'm a part of an international consortium called the Discourse and Psychosis Consortium, which, you know, bringing together multidisciplinary work on language and psychosis. And we actually have an international collaborative project right now, trying to look at the clinical dimensions of thought disorder and speech and language disorganization. And there's some, I think that the reason why it's so confusing to teach residents the difference between, like, you know, tangentiality versus circumstantiality is that there's not that much of a difference. But we have been finding consistent factor structures that seem to be generalizable across languages. There's certainly the breakdown of like positive versus negative thought disorder, which I think can be fairly reproducibly identified. But within positive thought disorder, it's emerging for us, at least in our data, that there might be a distinction between breakdown of thought within the unit of the utterance itself, so the more severe incoherence that's specific to psychosis, compared to a dissociation between concepts, like in tangentiality and circumstantiality. And I guess I'm sorry to take it over, but like my thought would be that perhaps with something like that, there's a more consistent conceptual, like a match between the conceptual framework and the observations that will make it easier for us to teach, because they're actual real entities rather than, you know, different sides of the same coin. Yeah.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, and I think, though, again, at the end, we'll have a lot of time to continue. I actually think that type of question and sharing answers is wonderful. So, but for now, we will turn it to the next speaker, Dail Chun.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'm Dail, and I'm one of the Jeff's students. So today I'm really excited to share more detailed analysis that Einat gave you, more bigger picture of the project. So in this talk, I'm gonna share about the most recent work that we examined how speaking rate in their daily life is associated with their daily symptom fluctuations. Yeah. So I think we all agree that daily symptom fluctuations are really important to track, especially outpatient with serious mental illness, including like psychotic disorders, like bipolar, because for those patients, like symptom management is kind of the key. But even though we all agree that it's important, but I think we're not doing a great job of the symptom tracking because A, it's really expensive to do that, like using like clinicians, and also it's really burdensome. Like here in this room, like you guys cannot imagine yourself doing like daily symptom like tracking every day after your work, and that's another labor. So at least in the research field, what we used to do is we just ask participants to report their daily affect and daily symptoms, and those are great in terms of like collecting their like daily symptom fluctuation, but often they are heavily relied on patients' self-report. And self-report is a useful tool, but at the same time, it's more vulnerable to their subjective bias or recur bias. And sometimes even like they just don't report their symptoms. So in this case, we thought that behavior measures are really important because behavior measures such as acoustic linguistic features, it's relatively more objective than patient self-report. And at the same time, if we can use some like passive like methods to collect their behavior measure, then we don't have to like ask participants or like make participants really burdensome. So in this study, we look into the acoustic features, and perhaps if we can find some evidence that their acoustic features is related to their daily symptom fluctuation, if we find those strong evidence, then maybe in the future we can use like behavior measure alone to like monitor, keep tracking their daily symptom fluctuations. However, we didn't know really well on the dynamic relationship, like using acoustic features and daily symptom fluctuations. We kind of have understanding that patients with like mania, for example, their speaking rate is tend to be higher than people without mania. But we don't know really well how their daily symptom fluctuation, their daily mania fluctuation is related to their speaking rate in their daily life. So that's why we conducted this research. Yeah. So we recruited 70 outpatients diagnosed with serious mental illness, with psychosis, and 1/4 of the patients were diagnosed with primary psychosis, including schizoaffective, schizophrenia, and the majority of patients were diagnosed with affective psychosis, including bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and major depressive disorder. So here's how we collected the data. So as Einat already presented, we asked participants to report their daily symptoms and daily affect using their smartphone. So there are some questions asking about their daily affect and their social level, and some physical questions about their sleep or their energy level. And also we measure some stress and anxiety, and some questions were related to psychosis. And in addition to that, we ask participants to report their audio diary. So it was just ask participants to freely record how was their day. And using that voice data, we extract speaking rate using OpenSmile. And how we measure speaking rate was we measure the number of fundamental frequency of their voice, and number of fundamental frequency onsets per second was used as a proxy. And what does that mean is at fundamental frequency, it's kind of capturing when people make vowel sounds. So that means if speaks out more vowel sounds per second, then it can be used as a proxy to measure their speaking rate. And the total number of observation, completed both daily measure and daily audio diary, was 10,266. And the number of observations per participant, it varied, but the 25th quantile of the number of observation per participant was around 150, and the median was almost around year, and the 75th percentile was 550. So we collected long enough data to see their daily symptom fluctuations. And here's the analysis part. So because we were interested in how their daily symptom fluctuations are related to their speaking feature, First, we decompose those daily symptom variables into within and between person level data because repeatedly measured variable, it's actually composed of two components. One is their average, their between person level, and the other one is how their actual observations are deviated from their baseline or average. So that's why we use the decomposition of the variance. And in order to extract the within person deviation from the mean, we just simply subtracting their observations from their participants' average. And then using those only within person deviation data, we ran factor analysis for daily affect and symptoms. And the reason why we ran factor analysis was we wanted to reduce some dimensionality of the variables because the daily symptom and affect are almost 30 items. So it's kind of impossible to examine how all of those items are related to speaking rate. So that's why we wanted to reduce some dimensionality. And also we wanted to see and capture how those transdiagnostic patients experience similar latent symptoms. So we wanted to capture some transdiagnostic symptom structure at within person level. And using those within person level factor structure, we conducted dynamic structure equation modeling to capture a dynamic relationship between those within person level factors and speaking rate. And DSAM is kind of the best methods that we could have used because it allowed us to not only capture some cross-lagged effects between those variables, and at the same time, it allows us to use a multi-level data structure. And here's the results. And those are the 6 factors at within person level for the daily symptom and affect. So we came up with the 6-factor model based on the model fit and also theoretical justification. So anxious stress and negative arousal, it's more about physical activity, and distress, irritability, and positive arousal, and social activity. So those are the 6 latent transdiagnostic factor structure at within person level we found. And using those within person factor, we ran DSAM. So this is kind of the full model that we conducted, and it looks so complicated. And what it just does is, so we examine the cross-lagged relationships, which is also commonly known as cross-lagged panel model. And also we examine the concurrent relationship between the daily factor and also speaking rate. And the black dot over there, that represents that we allowed random effects. So we assume that those effects, cross-lag or concurrent effects, can vary across individuals. But for this talk, for simplicity, I'm going to just focus on the within person level, and also I'm going to just talk about the fixed effects that we found. So as you can see here, anxious stress yesterday, T-1 represent yesterday, and anxious stress T represent 2 days. So there's one lagged. Anxious stress yesterday, that we found some autocorrelation between the two, which indicates there were some symptom stability. And also we found some stability of the speaking rate. And interestingly, we found that anxious stress yesterday negatively impacted on their speaking rate. In other words, when patients experience greater anxious stress yesterday, then their speaking rate decreased the next day. And in terms of the other direction, speaking rate did not significantly impact on the next day's anxious stress, and also we did not find the concurrent relationship between anxious stress and speaking rate. And in terms of distress factor, we also found some autocorrelation. So there were some symptom stability of distress, and we did not find cross-lag effects of distress and speaking rate. So in terms of irritability, we also found some symptom stability and speaking rate stability, but we did not find the cross-lag effect. And that was same for the negative arousal. And here, in terms of like positive arousal, we not only found the symptom stability, but also we found that the positive arousal yesterday that positively impacted on patient's speaking rate the next day. And what does that mean? That when the patient experienced greater positive arousal yesterday, then it increased speaking rate the next day. And we did not find the other way. Speaking rate yesterday did not impact on the positive arousal today, and also we did not find significant concurrent relationship between positive arousal and speaking rate. And for social activity factor, we also found symptom stability, and we also found that social activity yesterday positively impacted on their speaking rate today. In other words, when patients experience like greater social activity, they experience more social, outgoing, then their speaking rate next day was increased. And also, we did not find the other direction, and also we did not find the concurrent relationship for social activity. Yep. So here's some like summary and conclusion. So we saw that like fluctuation in positive arousal and social activity that increased speaking rate the next day. So when patients experience like greater positive arousal, feel more happy and more energetic and more social, then and their next day speaking rate was increased. In other words, we can infer that increased speaking rate might have suggest that their like symptom has been fluctuated. They experience like greater symptoms. And as Einat presented, that positive arousal and mania was also related to the speaking rate. So we can say that increased speaking rate in patients' daily life, they can manifest that they experience like greater manic symptoms. And on the other hand, anxious stress was negatively related to the speaking rate the next day. So maybe when patients experience like greater anxiety, then their next day speaking rate might have like shown as a decreased. So from our analysis, we think that speaking rate, it could be a promising behavior marker for tracking patients' daily symptoms fluctuations, especially outpatient with like serious mental illness. However, this is kind of very new analysis, and we need more research in this field in terms of like within person level analysis. So we want to be also cautious of like overgeneralization. Yeah, but this is really exciting to see that. And yeah, so more research is needed for especially dynamic relationship like and in the patient's like daily life. Yeah, so yeah, thank you for listening to my talk, and I'd like to express my gratitude to our wonderful collaborators, Einat, like Dr. Baker's lab, and also my mentor, Jeff. Yep, thank you.
Great. So yeah, we could do some questions for sure.
That was a great talk and very interesting question, or a very interesting presentation. One of the questions that came up for me was basically how much are you able to predict speaking rate with a function of all the measures that you collected? So just at a high level, what's the amount of variance in the speaking rate that you're seeing with the measures? Because you can show that there's some correlations with various factors at different levels and kind of say, okay, this one's related to that one. But if I have those 30 measures that you collected, can I do a very good job of knowing your speaking rate tomorrow, or is it 10% of the variance or something like that?
I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I would say I don't think we looked at the R squared.
We didn't look at the R squared, so
standardized. You can talk a little bit about the magnitude.
The magnitude, yeah. So in terms of magnitude, because those effects are all standardized, so we can see, we can talk about the magnitude of the effects, and those are all standardized. So, and those are also like partial effects. Those paths are derived after accounting for the other path. So, if you are more positively aroused like yesterday, then that impacts like 0.1 or like 0.13 to your speaking rate. So it's in terms of like effect size, it's not like one-on-one relationship, but like it's also, if your speaking rate is only defined by your like positive arousal or those factors, then also that doesn't make sense. Also, this is like clinical data sets, so we kind of think that like there like some unusual speaking rate can be explained, like some like a 10% or like some, yeah, there's some variability.
I have a question, Dail. Thank you for that talk. I'll have to admit some of the DSM analysis didn't really went over my head. But can you, on a similar note, like how great was the both inter and intra-individual variability in the speaking rate? Is it something that's noticeable if you were talking to the study participant? And can you also explain why you use a fundamental frequency onset rather than just like words per minute as a speaking rate measure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting question. And the reason why we use like fundamental frequency, and also we extracted like number of words, we're gonna extract like the other speaking features as well. But this is kind of preliminary like results. And yeah, we also like playing some like, we just running a lot of models to like compare like which measures more represents the speaking rate. But yeah, I think the fundamental frequency, it's doing a quite like good job of representing the speaking rate. And I'm sorry, what was your first question? How noticeable is the variance in speaking? For a human observer.
Yeah, I think this is a great question.
Mhm.
It's a great question, and I think we always try, you know, these are the examples that I gave before, so I don't have an actual answer, an example from a patient, but this is absolutely what we try to do after, you know, seeing the statistical indications, go to the data and see whether they fit what our human ears and human brains can. I was going to add one thing, which is also, I think, important. These are audio surveys, so the person is talking to their own phone. In fact, it's possible that during actual interactions in those effects, I would hypothesize, might even be stronger, the rate effects in real-life communication, because you know, real-life communication is interactive and more stressful, and so the possibility of observing, you know, abnormalities might be greater in an interview, for example. So, just a thought.
So I have a question regarding two things really. One is I like the fact that you are reporting the p-value, but like the population will shift over time. So it would be good to have like a mechanism to actually account for data and model drift in this type of technology. And the other thing I was wondering if any of the people that were recording were foreigners that learn a second language, and if that affected actually your prediction and your performance went down in those populations.
You go ahead.
Yeah, I think, you know, usually in language studies we try not to include non-English speakers, but in this case, this is the sample is supposed to be representative of the population, of the clinical population. So there were a few Spanish speakers, and we have not looked at their data separately, and we have not excluded them from the data either. So, yeah, these are, yes.
Hello. I want to thank you for this presentation and the work that you've done, and the analysis is really great. My question is a little bit more forward-thinking, and maybe that's going to come later in the symposium. But I noticed you asked a question, like just an open question, like how was your day, I believe, or how's your day today? Do you think that question, going forward, would you ask a different question? Would you ask more questions? How many words, like how much language did you get from that question?
Like the length of the read? Yeah, duration.
The audio surveys were limited to 4 minutes. Do you have recommendations? What should I, more, yes? Yeah.
No, I mean, one of the things we've been toying around with, asking kind of that open-ended question, but also asking, but I do different type of language analysis, also asking people like list 4 things or things like that. And we've been trying to play with back and forth which ones are better as far as feature extraction. But I think the simplicity in what you did, it's accessible to everyone. Like everyone can answer that question, and it's like something at a level. So I just want to commend you for it. And I was curious to know.
I think, Cheryl, I'm not, but just want to say that from what we saw, there are different types of people, and it is amazing how people are open to disclosing, really what is going on in their real life without much they really use this as a true audio journal. So they don't need much direction.
That's a great question. I was part of the group that came up with that question about 10 years ago. So it has a lot of mileage, and I may be biased, but I think it performs pretty well. It actually came out of, our language analysis came out of having transcripts from people who did qualitative research. Zarina and I and other people got training in qualitative research from Larry Davidson at Yale. You can not only get 4 minutes, you could get 40 minutes, starting with that question. I'll give you the microphone soon. The benefit of having it open-ended is there are a few things. One, it's ecologically valid, but also you sort of get out of the way of the person that you're talking to, because if it's very structured, even if you choose a topic, then how are you going to do sentiment analysis? And we were really interested in coherence, so we kept it very, very open-ended. But it's a prompt that is an AMP schizophrenia we're using in many diagnoses, so it has legs.
Well, I think for now we'll move on, but if you have a thought or a question, please write it down, and again, we'll come back to it at the end. Next up, we have Dr. Daniel Lowe.
Great. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be here. Yeah, they already introduced the name of the talk. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Epidemiology and Psychology at Harvard. I'm not a clinician. A little bit about me. I'm from Argentina, the land of Lionel Messi. I'm not as good at soccer as he is. I'm trying. And I'm more on the data science side. I did a master's in natural language processing in Europe, and my PhD, which I defended in May. And I have a few of the committee members here, so thank you for approving. Nice to see Cheryl and Einat. Was in speech and hearing bioscience and technology, and kind of focusing more on text processing, but also what I'll show today is the speech processing part. And now I'm trying to, develop this research program of speech and language biomarkers for suicidal thoughts and behaviors, bringing in causal inference, which I think is probably the next frontier with LLMs. Want to thank my PhD advisor, who mentored me a lot with this work, Satra, who's at MIT, and my postdoc mentors, Matt Nock and Miguel Hernan. Miguel Hernan is a causal inference researcher. And all the collaborators that were involved in this specific project, it's a huge project. A lot of data was collected, especially Kate Bentley, who's the senior author on the paper we're going to try to publish, and my funding sources. So my goal here is, a lot of us want to assess suicide risk, or we could think of some other, severe mental health condition, and we want to do this because it's a leading cause of death in the U.S., with about 1 death every 11 minutes in the U.S. in recent years. But when we use traditional rating scales, like if we use the 9th item of the PHQ-9 or the Columbia Severity Rating Scale, these types of assessments generally lead, to predictions that are just slightly above chance. And because we're using these binary, ordinary kind of categories that aren't that good at, predicting things like suicide attempts or suicide death. Right? So new ways are using, to do assessments, are using ecological momentary assessments, where we can ask someone, today, how strong was your urge to kill yourself from 0 to 10? So that's a rating scale. We can use speech, and these are different reviews looking at speech patterns in suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Or, if we transcribe what someone says or look at social media data or, transcripts of clinical interviews, we have text, right? So the issue with these traditional methods at the clinic is that most suicidal individuals don't visit the clinic regularly, so you wouldn't be able to do a Columbia Severity Rating Scale. So ideally, we would have a remote and ecological assessments, and EMA, provides this, as does, speech journal or text data from text messaging or social media. Often these assessments are cross-sectional, but these suicidal crises can be transient. Dan Coppersmith in our lab has shown that sampling dozens of times per day, you could see that these crises, a person who is suicidal is actually only, have high desire to die or intent for just a few hours normally, right? Most of the time they're not very suicidal. So ideally we would have kind of a continuous assessment, and again, these methods can provide that. And the traditional method requires someone to give a response, and they might not comply. And so that's where EMA, there's a lot of criticism to EMA because we don't think most people will want to fill out, these rating scale items for the rest of their life or as long as they have the condition, right? And then speech and text can provide, a benefit if people like to journal, they can continue doing that. Or if, we had something working with their, whatever they post on social media, then we could have that, right? And as others were saying, the issue with traditional assessments is that there's denial, minimization, stigma, social desirability effects where people might, give an inaccurate response. So that's where really speech comes in. It's kind of hard to hide symptoms. It's possible, but if someone doesn't want to be hospitalized, they might just answer, I'm not suicidal, but if they have psychomotor slowing, it might be harder to hide. So today I'll be talking about some prior studies finding speech patterns associated with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And then I'll talk about our study and some future directions. So a few years ago, we wrote this review, which is kind of one of the first reviews to look at many different acoustic features across many different psychiatric disorders. So do I have a pointer? Let's see. So like right here, we have fundamental frequency is kind of the main tone in speech. We see that it's generally in blue, which means that it's in depression. It's generally significantly lower in people who have a diagnosis of, let's say, major depressive disorder than in controls. And so we looked at different studies doing this, but at the time there wasn't a lot of research on suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so what is speech? Speech occurs when air comes from the lungs, passes through the vocal folds, which oscillate, producing a sound that then is filtered by the vocal tract, the oral cavity and nasal cavity. So here we're looking at the vocal folds from above. Air is coming towards us from the trachea and the lungs, and the two white membranes there are oscillating. And if they're tense, they might oscillate more. We produce a high tone, or if they're more loose, they might produce a lower tone, right? So this is a more naturalistic time audio signal, and it's me producing the vowel O in rainbow. I wanted to say Messi in this paper, but my Sadra didn't let me. He thought it wasn't a good idea and just put rainbow because of the rainbow passage. Boring, but anyway, there's kind of a waveform that repeats every 10 milliseconds here. I don't know if you can see it, and so we can count that, and that's the fundamental frequency. In my case, my voice tends to produce a tone. The main tone you're hearing is about 100 hertz. I think that's a baritone, right? Or what is that, a tenor? I think it's a baritone. So basically, already in the 90s, they found that there's kind of a lower intensity in speech with people who are suicidal versus controls, right? And then, now we're looking at different frequencies. The lowest one is the fundamental frequency, and then we have harmonics, multiples of that, over time. And you see that I'm kind of changing my inflection in fundamental frequency, but some folks kind of have it more flat. And this is very exaggerated. I don't know if people see this in the clinic, but basically, someone speaking very monotonously would not inflect their fundamental frequency, and this has been found as well in suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And then if we're not able to close the vocal folds well enough, and there's air that's leaking through as we phonate, then you might sound a little breathy, right? Which, might be very subtle. It wouldn't be necessarily a voice disorder in psychiatry, but there might be some of that going on, and that's kind of been indicated in some studies. And this could be captured by these two features, like harmonic to noise ratio or capsule break prominence. So prior work have generally been very small samples. They generally don't control for confounders, things that would affect both speech and mental health. And they're generally cross-sectional. And as has been shown, kind of the dynamics of mental health and speech is very important for biomarker development. And then they may be focused on a certain population like adolescents or Army veterans or just males. One of the main issues here is like, how do we define the ground truth of what is, we could think about any other disorder, but like, if we think of suicidal thoughts and behavior, some of these studies say, well, anyone who scores more than 0 on the 9th item of the PHQ-9, which means you have a very heterogeneous kind of group of people who are low risk and high risk, right? In our study, we have 163 individuals measured daily, so it's a longitudinal study, and we control for confounders. So they're recording from their phone, so it's more ecologically valid. And the target variable is a little bit more precise, although it is a pretty heterogeneous group. People who are hospitalized for suicide risk, right? So very high risk group. So the specific aims is we want to see these prior studies, and there's many more we talk about in the paper, but do acoustic variables change with increases in suicidal urge, which is kind of a form of suicidal ideation? So some of the prior findings we'd like to see if we can replicate with some better data or methods is if we find this softer speech, more monotonous speech, and voice quality degradation. That could be things like breathiness, like I was explaining, or roughness. So basically we have suicidal urge and one acoustic variable at a time, and we want to see if they're positively associated, which I'm representing in green, or negatively associated over time. And then that's just trying to replicate prior findings to make sense of them. But then obviously there could be missing variable bias, so you want to kind of include all the variables in a single model. And specifically what we were interested in seeing was what happens, we're going to be asking people is not just if they're suicidal on rating scales, but agitation and fatigue, right? So other affect items. And we know that agitation is kind of a risk factor. Being kind of restless is kind of a risk factor for suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Fatigue depends what kind of outcome you're looking at. So we don't really have an hypothesis there. And then basically we wanted to know if these arousal levels, agitation and fatigue, are mediating the associations we're finding with acoustic variables. So one would think suicidal urge is a little bit more cognitive, thinking about wanting to be dead, and that agitation and fatigue kind of are closer in a causal chain to speech production. So what we were expecting is something like this, where the acoustic variables are associated to suicidal urge through agitation and fatigue. And finally, we wanted to kind of integrate whatever we find through estimation in a qualitative kind of speech model integrating prior findings. So we have psychological variables that we ask through rating scales and acoustic variables that we extract through audio, but we want to kind of explain what's the connection here, right, through physiology. So we recruited folks who were hospitalized at MGH and McLean for suicide risk. They were enrolled for several days, and then they were tracked for 28 days after discharge. It was a very high-risk period. So 6 times per day, we asked them affect items and suicidal ideation items. And then once per day, we recorded speech, sustaining a vowel, reading sentences, or recording naturalistic speech, which is what I'll show today, the last one. Asking them, how are you doing today? What happened today? Stuff like that. So for the first one, what we're doing is we're fitting a regression model, trying to see the association with one acoustic variable at a time with suicidal urge. And we're controlling for these confounders that could affect speech and affect mental health. And it's a mixed effects model, and we're letting the slopes be nonlinear. So because we have multiple samples per individual. And so we recruited 163 individuals. They're all adults. Average age was 34, predominantly white, predominantly female. And so this ends up being kind of the largest study of suicidal speech to date, and I really want to congratulate Kate Bentley, who led the data collection effort. And so what we're seeing here is all their submissions, both EMA and voice samples, centered on discharge date, right? So what we see is we have a lot more data post-discharge, right, which is what I'll be looking at right now, because more powered. About 16 samples post-discharge and 6 samples, speech samples inpatient. And so for this specific aim of replicating prior findings, what we find is that we don't find monotonous speech, so we didn't replicate this finding. We see that the standard deviation of F0 goes up a bit, but we do see softer speech, and we do see this kind of voice quality degradation, which could be indicating breathiness, as other studies have found. But these standardized effects are quite small, not necessarily good enough, I would think, for biomarkers. But we did find the same thing when we looked at like sustaining vowels or reading sentences. And that's after bone-for-earning correction. The second thing was kind of integrating into a multivariate acoustic network. So what we found is that, there's a positive association between fatigue, agitation, and suicidal urge. And indeed, I'm simplifying the network analysis I did visually. What we did find was this mediation. There were other effects, but all the acoustic variables were associated to suicidal urge through arousal states. And again, very, very small effects. And so here I really want to send a message, like a call to the field. So we want to reconcile converging and contradictory evidence into a theoretical model, qualitative theoretical model that can be debated and updated for hypothesis generation and theory building. So kind of proposing, a first suicidal speech model. So there's a lot of evidence, some folks who have suicidal ideation have some aversive internal state like sadness or hopelessness that could lead to suicidal ideation, which could lead an urge to escape, which could lead to suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation might help regulate negative affect, which makes it be reinforced. And there's a lot of literature on that. And then what we might find in a machine learning model and a statistical model is that intensity goes down, right? Which I'm trying to indicate here. So one might think, okay, suicidal ideation, as that goes up, you speak a little softer, right? That's kind of the working model a lot of us have when we do feature importance analysis in machine learning. But what I want to argue is that really what's probably happening is your sadness or your hopelessness or things like this are probably making you more restless, agitated, or fatigued, and probably both in the same person at different times. And that, if you're agitated, that will increase lung pressure, which will increase intensity, and if you're fatigued, the opposite will happen, right? It's not that suicidal ideation is directly affecting intensity, right? They might have a common cause. So I did this for many different acoustic variables, so now when you do a biomarker study, you can kind of go to the last column, which are the acoustic variables, and try to make sense of how they're connected to psychological variables through physiology. And how are we doing on time? Not too good. So we recorded a lot of naturalistic speech, so we have a lot of text data. Other work of mine on text data is kind of measuring 49 different risk factors for suicidal thoughts and behaviors through lexicons I generated with GPT-4, and then use semantic similarity methods to capture tokens that aren't in the lexicon. And I created an open source package where you can quickly develop lexicons for any construct you might want to measure, or most of them. Identifying bias is another aspect in speech biomarkers that is often overlooked. And so we have a series of recommendations for avoiding, identifying, and mitigating bias in speech biomarker work. And finally, our lab, the lab I was in during my PhD, is developing this package to kind of quickly extract features that are a little better than Open Smiles and EG Maps, especially Foreman's, and with others like Nick Cummings and Visar Barisha, we're putting together like a list of features that we recommend and how to go about selecting them for your study. Finally, we organize, I founded this Harvard-MIT Speech and Language Biomarker Interest Group, which organizes talks just like this one, which you can join, and they're all on Zoom, and we have recorded sessions as well. And finally, I wanted to shout out Bridge 2A, which is a consortium, 11 institutions collecting a kind of representative data set of mental health and speech that all of you will be able to use. It's representative sample, ethically sourced, and I designed the protocol for the mental health side of it. So I tried to measure many different symptoms, include many different symptoms there. So the takeaways are that suicidal individuals tend to have a softer voice with a degraded voice quality, perhaps indicating breathiness or roughness. And the point I want to make is that speech biomarkers might not be measuring cognitive states like suicidal ideation directly, but rather physiological arousal states like agitation and fatigue, and so we should think about that. And so we introduced the field's first suicidal speech model to help researchers explain biomarker models. That's it. So it's trying to say, on average, for people across multiple days, on average, what are these associations? So it's a group level analysis. I did the lagged one, and what's interesting about the lagged one is you see that basically this association here, I think it was people who are fatigued tend to be less suicidal the next day, and people who are agitated tend to be more suicidal. So it's really also important to think that it's not like we have, just people with psychomotor slowing, and then we have people who are agitated, right, and high arousal, but it's more that some people are oscillating between these states, and obviously it's going to create a completely different speech profile, right? And so I think a lot of your work is addressing this. It's like, we can't just build a model that works for one of these states, right, or mixes these states, but kind of, it can be able to, find the patterns that change when people are high arousal or low arousal. Yeah, sure.
Hi, Daniel. That was a great talk. My question is about specificity. So the cohort that you're studying was defined, right, by having suicidal ideation. But ultimately, I know you're doing a mechanistic study and looking at physiology. You might want to use this as a screen. You might want to think about specificity. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, great question. So, everyone here was, admitted for suicide risk and was hospitalized for a few days. These models, I don't find them. I didn't prove or make any claims on prediction, right? When I did out-of-sample prediction and looked at specificity and sensitivity and other things, there wasn't a strong enough effect. It wasn't random. There was an effect, but it wasn't very strong. And I think it has to do with a few things. One thing is this is still a very heterogeneous group. You have people with major depression, a lot of comorbidities, but bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, different medications which would confound things. And then you're recording people, in the wild, and even though 163 people over 28 days sounds like a lot for research, it's probably not enough to tease out the signal from all these different recording environments, right? So people have different types of background noise, which is being studied here, and so this is a big issue, I think. I think we'll need a lot more data and, if we can, more precise dependent variable. So maybe just folks with psychomotor slowing would be much more homogeneous group to try to target. But again, another problem might be that we're measuring kind of this cognitive state that might be very distant to the speech we're trying to measure them with. Yeah. Okay.
One last question.
Okay.
So it's very related to what you were just saying. I thought this was very interesting work, but you kind of said very briefly, and I thought it was really interesting that, the item 9 on PHQ-9 has just better than chance at predicting suicidal urge and ideation. You did a lot of measurement here. I know you were saying you need more to do better prediction, but you did a ton of measurement, and I'm very curious, given this and coming up with, let's say you put it into a neural net predictive model, how good can you do on the accuracy with all the measures you have here, and how much better is it, if at all, than the item 9 on PHQ-9? In other words, empirically, how hard of a question are we facing in terms of predicting the temporal variation in suicidal urge, and how much is left to be explained on that variance?
Yeah, great question. I can answer with other studies in our group because I don't have that score for this data set. But with other studies, we've been able to outperform some of the rating scale items with text-based models. But suicidal thoughts and behaviors are very kind of multi-causal, complex, phenomena. So our lab has done, is about to publish one study where it's 400, 500 people trying to predict if they're going to make a suicide attempt within the next week from rating scales, and the prediction isn't very good, right? So it really depends what you look at, and it's a low base rate phenomenon. It's very few cases, which is good. But that's, I think, one of the main limiting factors from a machine learning point of view, right? You're gonna have a small percentage of people go on and make an attempt. So then you have this imbalanced data set, and it's very hard to find a signal. The same people, right, some weeks are not making an attempt, and some weeks are. And so you have, a very similar person, and you might not have the right information. But that's what we're trying to figure out, how well you can do it. But in other studies where we compared at least text processing kind of approaches with rating scales, we were able to do quite a good job. And then obviously there's situations where you don't have any rating scales, like I work with crisis text line. So it's just a conversation that's text-based, and you want to be able to make an assessment from the text if you can, right? Yeah. Cool. Oh, yeah, we're at time.
Yep,
thank you.
Sorry.
Sorry
No worries. Yeah, just want to make sure we leave enough time for the last speaker. So thank you, Dr. Lowe. And last but not least, we will have Dr. Zarina Bilgrami.
I'm not a doctor yet, but
Oh, sorry. Well, aspirational.
hopefully. Yeah. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about using large language models to understand thought disorder and predict psychosis in an at-risk group. No disclosures. And just to talk a little bit about thought disorder first, the connection between psychosis and language is not new. Kraepelin and Bloiler really found this to be a foundational part of dementia praecox and schizophrenia when they were first kind of outlining it. And then Nancy Andreessen really made thought disorder very concrete in her thought, language, and communication scale, and she described, these key disruptions of tangentiality and derailment, illogicality, incoherence, providing us with like a systematic framework for how to understand how language reflects thought and disordered thinking. And so this work was instrumental in highlighting how psychosis is not just a disorder of perception or delusion, but also in communication and thought. And language, in a sense, in this group in particular, serves as a window into the mind and an outward marker of the internal thoughts and how they're structured, or in the case of psychosis, disrupted. And so building on Andreessen's insights, researchers have been really interested in answering the question of whether language disruptions can serve as early indicators of psychosis. So the question really is, can we detect subtle signs in speech that predict which at-risk individuals will go on to develop a threshold psychotic disorder? And recent research suggests that yes, but there are some limitations to some of the more traditional methods. So a lot of this work has focused on examining the local properties of language. For example, part of speech tagging, how do people use pronouns and nouns differently, and how does that help us predict who will get psychosis? Syntactic complexity, semantic density have been key focuses, and these have provided valuable insight, and in a lot of samples have been really useful in predicting psychosis. But they are limited to this local dimension, and they don't capture this bigger picture of how language is used to organize and convey ideas over time. And language isn't just about individual words, but how these come together in sentences and thoughts, and how we can capture that. And before I go into how we tried to capture that, I want to give you some examples of this local and global thought disorder distinction. This is a quote from Ellen Sachs from the Center Cannot Hold. And she's in a very acute state of psychosis here, and she is asked by a doctor, is anything wrong? And she responds, there's cheese and there's whizzes. I'm a cheese whiz. It has to do with effort and subliminal choice, vertigo and killing. And so I don't think any of us can make very much sense of what's going on here, but what I want to highlight is it's the connection between words here that's really disrupted. That's what makes it so hard to follow. But then if we look at something like this, and this is from an interview that I did a few years ago, and it's changed quite a bit to protect the identity of the person, But, I just, during this interview, asked about this girl's vacation and the fact, I followed up on the fact that she'd be staying with her godfather. And I won't have us read the whole thing, but you can see how she starts to talk about her godfather and her family and her childhood with them. And then she kind of slips into the fact that she doesn't feel like other people. And then eventually she starts to talk to me about things that we had talked about in the last time we were together, which is some, perceptual things, like she has trouble being in fluorescent lighting. And so I just want to highlight how even though the sentences might connect to the one, just before it, we are covering a lot of ground in not a lot of time, right? This is maybe 2 paragraphs worth of text, but we have so many topics that we're covering. And so this is what Andreessen would call derailment, and what we're trying to model here. And we are using large language models to do that modeling, to do this quantitatively for the first time. And so the key here is that we can leverage a few components of large language models. One is that they're extremely sensitive to context. So this means that they can track the flow of ideas over relatively large bodies of speech. So the slide before with, they can track the flow of ideas across her speech. They're also generative, and so we can ask them to actually produce not just a word or make a prediction of the next word, but actually the next sentence. And so we can measure in ideas rather than just words, which traditionally has been how we've done predictive modeling with large language models. So in this study, we used Llama 3, the 70 billion parameter version, and we used a group of Naples participants. So these are all individuals at clinical high risk. This was their baseline interview, meaning that we did not know who would go on to get a psychotic disorder in the future, and eventually 7 of them did, and 23 of them remained non-converters, so they did not go on to develop a psychotic disorder. And these groups were matched on age, race, sex, IQ, and medication usage at baseline during the interview. So when you use a large language model, you kind of orient them to the task they're going to be doing, and so we call these system prompts, and we gave the model 2 system prompts. So we told it that it's going to be guessing the next sentence, so a whole sentence from an interviewee, and that they're going to be comparing 2 sentences in terms of semantic similarity. Just to give you a little bit more detail, like I said, we took the SIPS clinical interview, so their diagnostic interview for clinical high-risk status, and for each sentence that they said across the interview, we labeled that as a target sentence. And in the first part of our study, we varied the amount of context that we gave Llama to make a prediction about what that target sentence was. So first we tried 1 sentence, 2 sentences, 3 sentences, and so on. And then once we had Llama's generated target sentence, we then compared this to what the subject actually said, and we used similarity scoring on a scale of 0 to 9. We had Llama generate that similarity score using this prompt: how semantically similar are these 2 sentences? So in the second part of the study, we did the same thing, but we held the amount of context that the model received constant, and we then varied the ordering of the context sentences to disrupt the flow of ideas. We did actually keep the penultimate sentence before the target stable, just to orient the model a little bit, but then we varied the order of the preceding context sentences, so we disrupted any flow of ideas that was there in the speech. And then again, we had Llama generate a guess for the target sentence and compare that to what was actually said. So our predictions for these 2 parts of the study was that large language models will be better at predicting sentences in non-converters than converters, and this is just because presumably converters have less organized speech. We also predicted that disrupting the flow of ideas, so doing that shuffling in the context sentences, would reduce the model's ability to predict subject's language. We thought that this effect would actually be less pronounced on converters because their baseline speech was already disorganized, and so shuffling it wouldn't really have much of an effect. So for the first part of our study, these are our results. So how much context was beneficial, and did this differ for converters and non-converters? And the answer was yes. So we did see, where's my mouse? A peak around 4 to 6 sentences, and in that range overall, non-converters were more predictable than converters. And I want to show you what Llama is kind of producing during this. And so on the left, you'll see the similarity score that it generated. And the context, this is not the context that the model actually received because that would be too large to put on a slide, but I just wanted to orient you to where in the clinical interview we are. And then you'll see the subject sentence and Llama's prediction for that sentence. So, in the first one, you'll see, the interviewer asked, did you feel like there was a presence behind you? And we see that Llama gives a really, really close prediction to what the subject actually said. So the subject says, I turned and there was no one there, and Llama basically says the same thing and adds a but. In the second one, it's a little bit more complicated. So the interviewer asks, can you explain the deja vu you're experiencing to me? And the subject says, it's like when I do or see something, I get the feeling as if I've been there or seen that before. And Llama is guessing, like I've already experienced the exact same situation or conversation before, even if I know I haven't. And I want to highlight here that Llama is producing a more polished version, and there certainly is signal in the fact that there are kind of these local speech abnormalities in clinical high risk that are very useful for prediction, but we've given the task of comparing ideas and comparing thought to the large language model, and I think the fact that it thinks that these two are very similar is actually a really good sign that it's doing what we're asking it to do. And then if you look at the fourth line, we have one that it gauges as a little bit less similar between Llama's prediction and the subject sentences. And so in this part of the interview, the context is, have you felt that things happen around you and have a special meaning just for you? And the person starts by saying, yeah, sometimes, one time at my uncle's, and then they go on to say, I saw a strap on a dog. And Llama predicted, I remember it vividly like it was yesterday. And so I think here we see, I would probably predict more what Llama said. And I did go back and I looked at the transcript, and it was a very bizarre story that unfolded about the dog, and this person was indeed a converter. So I think that is a nice, highlight here for the fact that Llama's tracking the fact that these ideas are not at all similar. Okay. So just to review the shuffling condition, so holding the amount of context the same, we shuffled the flow of ideas, so we shuffled the sentences of context and then had Llama do the same predictions. And here we found a couple things. So we're seeing here that in the intact condition, right, so context is just as it appears in the transcript, like I presented in the line graph before. Non-converters are significantly more predictable than converters. So converters are less predictable overall. And then when we do the shuffling, we see the same effect, that they are still just less predictable than non-converters. What I think is interesting here is that we did not actually see the differential effect for converters, but we did see that shuffling impacted both groups significantly. So if you look at blue to blue and green to green, we see that for non-converters, shuffling did really disrupt the flow of ideas, and it made their speech less predictable, and that was also the case for non-converters. So in terms of our hypotheses, it does seem that large language models are better at predicting sentences overall in non-converters than converters, and disrupting the flow of ideas in context sentences reduces the model's ability to predict subject's language. We did not find that this was less pronounced in converters, so shuffling still had a pretty big impact on their language. But also more broadly, I think, as we try to build models that predict psychosis, this is such a heterogeneous population clinical high risk, and so the local effects, like when we study semantic similarity and, things that are between words and sentences, those have a lot of impact, but it doesn't mean we aren't missing people who are better predicted by these more global disruptions in thought. So adding these into our predictive mechanisms and building out kind of using large language models and building models that can do that is going to be really helpful going forward to capture this heterogeneity. And we are lucky that we have large language models to do this, because they really do, we are seeing in the study that they're using context really dynamically to track the flow of ideas across these large swaths of speech. Yeah, and so hopefully we can use this as a measurement of conversion in global thought disorder. And with that, I would like to, doesn't want me to thank anybody, okay. I would like to thank my advisor, Phil Wolf, with whom this could never have happened, and Elaine Walker for her data, and Cheryl for her guidance before I started my graduate work, and then also the AMP Schizophrenia Consortium. We hope to do a lot of this predictive modeling using these tools in this very large data set, where we can capture the heterogeneity, but also really dive into understanding it and using these mechanisms to improve prediction. Thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing work, Zarina. Congratulations. And it must have been, I didn't catch a specific number, but it must have been a fairly large effect size if you were able to see this and even see it across conditions with just 7 converters, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And I just had a clarification question and then more of a real question, how much in terms of the context that Llama took in when it was doing the predictions, how much was that, I guess? How
in
much
the shuffling?
Yeah, or no, not for the shuffling, just like in general, was it able to take in the whole interview, or is it a window of a specific number of words?
So we found it's optimal to give it about 4 to 7 sentences of context. I do think that is partly because it's a clinical interview, and so when you switch topics and ask questions and the interviewer is kind of directing what people are talking about, you are going to have these chunks of kind of semantically similar ideas. But you probably, if you did it in an open-ended interview, which I hope that we will do, we might see that for different people it takes actually different amounts of time to get derailed. Some people, like sentence could be derailed, and they could have like these really kind of big leaps, and for some people it could kind of happen more slowly and unfold over time. So I think, going toward a more like individualistic or like personalized medicine approach like a lot of the speakers took today, I think that will be a goal in the future, is to figure out how much context is needed per person to kind of see that derailment.
Yeah, that's great, and then that's really interesting. And then I had another question about why did I have some thoughts myself, but I was wondering from your perspective why you chose to use a prompt to ask about similarity versus calculating it mathematically.
So we did both. At one point we used T5 to do this, and so they have a similarity scoring system that's trained and based on human similarity assessments. So we did use that. We didn't find very different results, and this is just a lot easier, right? To not like find another model and get it running and then like feed things into the model. If Llama can just do it, it makes it more scalable. Mm-hmm.
I'm talking again. Zarina, that is fantastic. I'm so proud of you. Yay. So I'm kind of freaked out by those 8 and 9s, and I'm wondering how often they happen. Can Llama really predict, like can you bring that slide back out? I found that chilling, that Llama could predict like pretty much exactly what the person would say. And have you done this in healthy individuals? And do we have to worry that like we can't say anything that will surprise anyone?
Unless you're psychotic. The benefits of being psychotic are so clear now.
we're in a simulation.
So,
Yeah,
This
Cheryl,
one?
yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking the same thing, Cheryl, and how do you think, I mean, it's in the,
Yeah.
it's in the interview, right?
Yeah.
So how generalizable is this?
I do
to other
want to like say when we do this in the open-ended interview, I'm not sure it's going to be as good because people are allowed to bring much more to the table. They're constrained by the interview, right? And let's do it.
Maybe one more question?
yeah, so in a way, actually, this shows that the model is biased, right? Because it's been trained on only normal
Healthy speech,
people.
yeah.
Yeah, of course. So for digital therapeutics, there is the concept of therapeutic fidelity, which is like the longer you go, the more you make sure that actually the model stays on track. For tools like this, for deep phenotyping, it would be good to actually see when you move from the structured text to long-term
Yes.
effect, if actually it remains.
Yeah. I think that's part of what we'll be doing in AMP Schizophrenia. We have both these structured interviews recorded and these open-ended interviews and actually daily diaries. So we have a bunch of different types of language samples for each person. And so I'm really hoping to do some of that careful methodological work to really investigate, does the language sample matter? Because I have a feeling it very much does.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again for coming. It's a great community. Good questions. We'll be up here for the next couple minutes if you want to talk with us one-on-one, but I think now we're supposed to do a break for 10 minutes, and then we'll be back in this room for our first keynote. So thank you so much.